Do you remember those soul food desserts that used to be at every family reunion? These desserts anchored the day, carried in foil pans and made with real care. What does it say that the sweets we once expected have slowly disappeared? Pound cake plain or finished with a bright lemon glaze was the steady, dependable reunion dessert that anchored every long table and carried the taste of family history in every slice. Grandmothers mixed the batter by hand in large bowls, their movements slow and sure as they blended butter, sugar, eggs, and flour into a thick, smooth mixture that promised comfort long before it ever reached the oven. As it baked, the kitchen filled with a warm, sweet scent that drifted out the door and into the yard, pulling cousins and neighbors inside with the promise of something familiar. When the cake was finally unmolded, it stood tall and golden with a firm crumb that sliced cleanly and never crumbled, even when carried from house to car to reunion hall. Some families preferred it plain, letting its soft, buttery flavor shine, while others poured a glossy lemon glaze over the top, letting it drip down the sides and cling sweetly to the edges. Pound cake was beloved because it tasted like effort and patience, and because it fed a crowd without ever needing decoration. It traveled well, sat proudly on every dessert table, and never failed to disappear slice by slice as people passed by with paper plates in hand. It was not dramatic, but it was unforgettable because it tasted like home gathering stories and hands that knew exactly how long to beat the batter. 7-Up cake was the bright citrus-soaked reunion classic that brought a cheerful spark to every dessert table thanks to its airy texture and lemon-lime sweetness. The batter mixed into a pale, silky pour that gained its lift from the soda folded carefully inside a trick that made the cake light, tender, and bursting with flavor. As it baked, the kitchen filled with a fresh citrus scent that felt like summer even on cloudy days, and children hovered near the oven, hoping the timer would ring early. When the cake cooled, it revealed soft golden curves shaped by the bundt pan, making it one of the most eye-catching desserts at any family gathering. A warm sugar glaze was poured over the top, soaking into every ridge and giving each bite a sweet, bright finish. Families looked for it at every reunion because it tasted like celebration without costing much to make. Each slice carried the memory of afternoons spent laughing outdoors and long tables full of food that brought people together year after year. Sock it to me. Cake arrived at reunions in heavy bundt pans, carried carefully by aunties who knew the warm, spiced swirl inside would be gone before the day ended. The batter was mixed thick and smooth, then layered with a ribbon of cinnamon sugar and chopped nuts that baked into a hidden filling rich enough to earn its reputation. When the cake rose in the oven, the air filled with the scent of spice, warmth, and sweetness drifting through kitchens and across picnic shelters until people started asking who made it. Once cooled, it turned out beautifully with a golden crust and a tender crumb that sliced cleanly, revealing the dark, sweet swirl inside. A simple glaze poured over the top gave it a soft shine and made each slice taste like something crafted with skill passed down over generations. Sock it to me cake became a reunion favorite because it felt special without being fussy, and because its comforting flavors made every person at the table feel welcome. Peach cobbler was the bubbling reunion dessert that pulled people toward the kitchen long before the pan ever hit the table, filling the air with the smell of peaches, sugar, and warm spices. Whether made from fresh peaches in the summer or canned peaches during the rest of the year, the filling cooked down into a thick, golden mixture that tasted like sunshine and memory. The crust varied from family to family, sometimes a lattice, sometimes a full sheet of dough, sometimes spooned on like dumplings, but always baked until brown, crisp, and irresistible. When the cobbler came out of the oven, the juices bubbled around the edges, and the scent wrapped itself around the entire gathering, making people line up with bowls in hand. Served warm with melting ice cream, or on its own, it tasted like the heart of southern Sundays and long afternoons, spent talking, laughing, and passing plates across crowded tables. Peach cobbler was more than dessert. It was a tradition carried proudly by the cooks who prepared it year after year. Sweet potato pie was the deeply rooted reunion dessert tied to gardens, home kitchens, and family wisdom passed down through generations. Grandmothers roasted sweet potatoes until their skins loosened and the flesh turned soft and sweet, then mashed them with milk sugar eggs and warm spices until the filling glowed a deep orange. Poured into a homemade crust and baked slowly, the pie set into a silky custard that carried the taste of memory in every bite. Its aroma filled kitchens with the scent of nutmeg, cinnamon, and roasted sweetness, reminding everyone of holidays, harvests, and the hands that taught them how to cook. At reunions, sweet potato pie stood proudly beside every cake, cobbler, and pudding because it represented history, home, and identity. One slice held the softness of family stories and the strength of those who baked it long before modern recipes existed. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers was the dessert that always arrived in the biggest glass dish, the one carried with two hands, because it was filled to the top with layers of comfort, history, and family pride. Grandmothers lined the bottom with vanilla wafers and then poured warm homemade custard over them, letting the cookies soften slowly until they became part of the pudding itself. Tender, sweet, and soaked with flavor. Sliced bananas were tucked between the layers in soft, pale rounds, adding freshness that lifted the sweetness and made the dish feel alive. More custard came next, then more wafers, and then another layer again until the dish was nearly overflowing. Some finished it with whipped topping, while others insisted on meringue browned in the oven until the peaks turned golden. When the dish hit the reunion table, spoons clattered against bowls and children rushed forward because everyone knew banana pudding disappeared fast. It tasted like childhood afternoons, like front porches, like kitchens filled with steam and voices talking over one another while dessert chilled in the refrigerator. Banana pudding was beloved not because it was fancy, but because every family made it slightly differently and each version carried its own memories. It was the dessert that united generations one scoop at a time. Red velvet cake with cream cheese frosting was the showstopper that signaled a celebration long before anyone sliced into the deep red layers shimmering under thick white frosting. The batter mixed into a smooth, vibrant red color that felt dramatic and festive as it poured into pans waiting to bake into soft, tender layers that held moisture like a secret. Once cooled, each layer was stacked carefully with generous spreads of cream cheese frosting, smooth, rich, and tangy enough to balance the sweetness of the cake. At reunions, this cake never blended into the background because its color stood bold against every other dessert, drawing eyes and calling people forward even before the meal was finished. Elders sliced it with pride, remembering holidays, anniversaries, and Sundays when red velvet marked something important. The flavor was warm, gentle, and comforting with a subtle cocoa note that made every bite feel familiar, even for those tasting it. For the first time, red velvet cake was a symbol of family joy, tradition, and the belief that reunions deserved a dessert that felt truly special. Pecan pie was the Southern reunion classic that tasted like sweetness, crunch, and memory baked into a golden brown slice that reflected the trees and fields many families grew up around. Grandmothers gathered pecans from the yard or accepted bags from neighbors who shared what their own trees had dropped, washing and sorting the nuts before stirring them into the glossy filling of sugar, eggs, butter, and syrup that came together like a thick, shining caramel. As the pie baked, the top formed a crackled layer of toasted pecans, while the inside stayed soft, sweet, and gooey, creating the perfect contrast when cut into warm slices. Served at reunions, pecan pie reminded everyone of fall harvests, winter holidays, and afternoons spent cracking shells on front porches while stories filled the air. It was rich but never overwhelming, and even a thin slice felt decadent and comforting. Families carried it to gatherings wrapped in foil or cloth and placed it proudly among the other desserts, knowing it would vanish quickly once plates were passed. Pecan pie carried history, flavor, and the strength of generations who knew how to make something precious from simple ingredients. Coconut cake was the tall, white, winter bright dessert covered in soft flakes that clung to the frosting like new fallen snow, making it one of the most beautiful desserts on any reunion table. The cake layers baked into soft, tender rounds that held moisture well, especially when brushed lightly with sweet coconut milk or simple syrup to deepen the flavor. The frosting was smooth and fluffy, often made from cooked icing or whipped cream cheese depending on the family recipe, and once spread across the cake, It formed the perfect base for the final snowy coating. Handfuls of coconut were pressed gently against the sides, falling lightly across the top until the cake looked like something crafted for celebration. Its flavor was light sweet and refreshing, offering a cool softness that balanced the heavier, richer desserts around it. Coconut cake tasted like reunions. Church gatherings and holidays rolled into one dessert as children reached for it. First drawn to the snowy look while adults reached for it last, wanting to savor the gentle sweetness. Bread pudding with raisins was the warm, thrifty dessert that turned stale bread into something soft, sweet, and unforgettable at every family reunion. Grandmothers tore leftover bread into pieces, soaking them in a mixture of milk eggs, sugar, and vanilla, until each piece absorbed the custard and softened into tender shapes waiting to bake. Raisins were sprinkled throughout, adding tiny bursts of sweetness that plumped up during baking, turning soft and juicy inside the warm pudding. As the dish baked, the top browned into a gentle crust, while the inside stayed soft, creamy, and full of flavor, filling the kitchen with a scent that wrapped around everyone like a blanket. Served warm from the oven, it tasted like comfort, simplicity, and the skill of elders who wasted nothing and created everything from what little they had. Bread pudding reminded families that desserts did not need to be expensive to feel like love. Caramel cake was the kind of reunion dessert that revealed who in the family had the patience and skill to stand over a hot stove, stirring icing long enough to make it perfect. The cake layers themselves were simple, tender and pale, but the icing was where the magic lived, thick, sweet, and slow cooked, until it deepened into a golden brown that tasted like butter, warmth, and memory. Grandmothers guarded their caramel icing method with pride because it took steady hands and a calm heart to keep the sugar from scorching as it bubbled and darkened in the pot. Once ready, the icing was poured over the stacked layers while still warm, spreading into silky drapes that coated every inch before cooling into a soft caramel shell. At reunions, the caramel cake always looked humble on the outside, but the moment it was sliced, people hurried forward for a piece because they knew the flavor inside carried generations of practice. The icing melted on the tongue with a sweetness that felt deep and comforting, and the cake beneath was tender enough to soak up every drop. Caramel cake tasted like real labor poured into something meant to be shared and celebrated. It reminded everyone that the best desserts came from time, attention, and love stirred slowly over a warm stove. Pineapple upside-down cake was the reunion dessert that sparkled with color and nostalgia, arriving in a well-seasoned pan lined with rings of pineapple and bright red cherries glowing like jewels beneath a caramel-like glaze. The batter was poured gently over the fruit, creating a soft cushion that baked into a moist golden layer, soaking up all the sweet syrup that bubbled beneath it. When the pan was flipped onto a plate, the cake revealed its glossy crown of fruit arranged in perfect circles, each slice holding a piece of pineapple nestled around a cherry that tasted like childhood summers. Families loved it because it was affordable, cheerful, and dependable, always turning out beautiful, no matter how crowded or warm the kitchen became during reunion cooking. The cake itself stayed tender and sweet, and the fruity topping made every bite feel light, even though it carried a richness from the brown sugar glaze. Pineapple upside-down cake added color to the dessert table and reminded everyone of potlucks, church suppers, and afternoons when cousins shared slices under trees while the adults talked nearby. Blackberry cobbler was the reunion favorite, made from berries that came straight from backyards, fence lines, or summer fields where children stained their fingers purple, gathering enough fruit to fill a pot. The berries cooked down with sugar until they released their deep purple juices, filling the kitchen with a smell that drifted like warm, sweet air across the entire gathering. The crust was dropped in thick spoonfuls or spread across the top, depending on family tradition, and it baked into a golden blanket that cracked open to reveal bubbling fruit beneath. Each scoop held sweet, tart berries wrapped in soft dough, and every bowl stained lips and spoons with the color of summer. Blackberry cobbler tasted like hot afternoon's laughter and the pride of bringing something homegrown to the reunion table. It was the dessert that vanished quickly because everyone wanted a taste of the season captured in a single dish. Chess pie was the pantry-friendly reunion dessert that proved simple ingredients could create something unforgettable with only a few motions of a practiced hand. Eggs, sugar, buttermilk, and a scoop of cornmeal mixed into a smooth, pale filling that baked into a golden top with a delicate crackle and a custard center that tasted sweet, warm, and familiar. The pie needed no fruit, no glaze, no decoration, because its flavor stood strong on its own, carrying a richness that came from the balance of creamy custard and a hint of cornmeal texture. At reunions, chess pie sat quietly beside the fancier desserts, but it never stayed untouched, because those who knew it understood its power. Each slice tasted like tradition thrift and the creativity of cooks who made something special from what they had on the shelf. Chocolate sheet cake was the reunion dessert designed to feed a crowd with soft, generous squares that children grabbed with both hands while adults reached for the corner pieces thick with frosting. The batter mixed into a smooth, dark pour that baked quickly in a large pan, rising into a tender cake that stayed moist even in summer heat. The warm cake received a melted chocolate frosting that spread easily over the top, settling into a shiny, smooth layer that cracked softly under the knife. Families loved it because one pan held enough for everyone, and because the flavor was rich, comforting, and impossible to resist. Chocolate sheet cake tasted like togetherness, celebration, and the joy of passing plates down long tables one piece after another. Molasses stack cake was the layered reunion dessert that carried Appalachian history into Black family gatherings where traditions blended and traveled through generations. Thin cake layers were baked one at a time in well-greased pans, each one soft, warm, and smelling of ginger, cinnamon, and deep molasses, sweetness. The filling was made from cooked molasses or spiced fruit spread into glossy layers that softened the cake as it rested overnight, turning the entire stack into a tender, richly flavored dessert that cut cleanly into tall slices. The cake was humble yet impressive, built from repetition, patience, and steady hands, moving in practiced rhythm across the kitchen. At reunions, it stood out because its flavor was warm and old-fashioned, and its height made people gather around with curiosity and appreciation. Every bite carried slow winter baking, homegrown molasses, and the memory of cooks who stretched ingredients into something celebratory. Molasses stack cake tasted like time, effort, and love stacked carefully into something sweet enough to share across an entire family. Hummingbird cake was the moist, fruit-filled reunion dessert that felt tropical, even under heavy summer heat, blending bananas, pineapple, and chopped nuts into a batter that baked into tender, fragrant layers. The cake came out soft, dense, and sweet with a texture that felt almost like banana bread lifted into a celebration cake. Once cooled, it was frosted with creamy, tangy icing that balanced the richness and made every slice feel decadent. Families loved hummingbird cake because it stayed moist for days, fed many people, and traveled well across long reunion tables. Its flavors were bright, comforting, and unmistakable, making it one of the first cakes to disappear. Whenever dessert plates were passed around, hummingbird cake tasted like sunshine, hospitality, and the joyful abundance that defined reunion gatherings. Fig preserves cake was the dessert that reflected the canning traditions many Black Southern families held dear, turning jars of sweet home-preserved figs into a dense spiced cake that tasted like memory itself. The preserves were folded into the batter, along with warm spices and chopped nuts, creating a moist, tender texture that stayed flavorful long after it baked. As the cake cooled, the aroma of fig, cinnamon, and caramel, like sweetness, filled the kitchen, drawing relatives toward the dessert table. Early fig preserves cake sliced into generous pieces that tasted both old-fashioned and luxurious, especially for families proud of their canning shelves. It was a dessert that honored the work of preserving summer fruit for winter and reunion meals. Apple Brown Betty was the cozy, thrifty dessert that showed up at reunions because it made good use of leftover bread biscuits or cornbread, turning them into something warm, comforting, and sweet. Apples were sliced thin, tossed with sugar, cinnamon, and a little lemon, and then layered beneath buttery crumbs made from whatever bread the cook had on hand. As it baked, the apples softened into tender slices surrounded by syrupy juices, while the topping browned into crisp, sweet bits that contrasted perfectly with the soft fruit beneath. Served warm, often with cream or ice cream, Apple Brown Betty tasted like home kitchens, autumn memories, and the creativity that turned simple scraps into something everyone loved. Buttermilk pie was the tangy, smooth reunion dessert that never lasted long, which is why most families baked two at a time, knowing the first would disappear before the dinner plates were cleared. The filling was made from buttermilk, eggs, sugar butter, and a touch of lemon baked into a custard that set into a firm, silky center with a lightly browned top. Each slice tasted bright, sweet, and slightly tart, resting inside a flaky crust that held everything together beautifully. Buttermilk pie was simple, reliable, and deeply comforting a dessert that brought people back for seconds and thirds. At reunions, it reminded everyone that the most memorable dishes often came from the simplest ingredients handled with care. Praline candy made with pecans was the after-dinner treat that moved from hand to hand at family reunions, wrapped in pieces of wax paper that stuck slightly to the sugary surface. These candies were cooked in heavy pots where butter, sugar, and evaporated milk simmered together until the mixture thickened into a fragrant caramel-colored base. She stirred constantly with a wooden spoon, watching for the moment when the mixture coated the spoon just right. Then she added the pecans, letting them tumble into the pot and soak up the sweetness before she dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper sheets spread across the counter. As the pralines cooled, they set into soft, rich pieces that melted on the tongue with a taste of butter, brown sugar, and roasted nuts. Children waited impatiently for them to harden, and adults reached for them with the same excitement. Praline candy felt like generosity because each piece was made by hand and shared freely across the reunion. It tasted warm, sweet, and familiar, carrying the flavor of tradition in every bite. Ambrosia salad was the bowl of sweetness that appeared in chilled dishes at nearly every reunion table, made from fruit coconut cream and the soft, fluffy textures families associated with celebration. She mixed oranges, pineapple, grapes, and cherries with whipped cream or sour cream, depending on family preference, stirring until everything glowed with color and looked like a rainbow poured into a bowl. Coconut flakes added texture and sweetness, while marshmallows softened into the creamy base, making each spoonful light yet rich and perfect for passing around before the heat settled in. Sometimes she added pecans. Sometimes she added a splash of cherry juice, but no matter the variation, the spirit of the dish stayed the same. Ambrosia salad was both simple and festive, offering cool relief during hot afternoons, when reunions stretched into long outdoor gatherings and children ran between tables barefoot. It tasted like summer fruit and shared laughter, and its bright colors made the dessert table look joyful, like a celebration that never needed permission to shine. Oatmeal raisin bars were the reunion dessert that traveled well sliced into sturdy squares that held together in warm weather and fed children quickly without fuss. She mixed oats, flour, butter, eggs, sugar, raisins, and a touch of spice into a thick batter that baked into golden, chewy bars with crisp edges and soft centers that stuck lovingly to napkins. When she cut them into neat rows, steam escaped, carrying the scent of cinnamon toasted oats and warm sugar that drifted across the yard like a soft announcement that dessert was ready. These bars were reliable, comforting, and easy to stack in tins for road trips or for handing out under shade trees. Sometimes she drizzled a bit of icing across the top, sometimes she left them plain, but they always tasted like home raisins, added bursts of sweetness in every bite, and the bars felt hearty enough to satisfy hungry relatives between games, conversations, and long hugs. Old-fashioned tea cakes were the soft, gently sweet cookies tied deeply to Black Southern history, appearing at reunions where elders remembered them from childhood and insisted they tasted just like they used to. She mixed sugar, butter, flour, eggs, and vanilla into a dough that rolled out smoothly before being cut into simple circles that held stories in their shapes. As the tea cakes baked, they puffed slightly and turned pale gold, releasing a warm scent that drifted through open windows and gathered people toward the kitchen. Their flavor was mild, sweet, and clean, which made them easy to pair with tea, coffee, or cold drinks on hot reunion afternoons when chairs circled under big oak trees. Sometimes she sprinkled a little sugar on top, sometimes she left them plain, trusting the dough to speak for itself. Tea cakes represented memory, continuity, and the quiet pride of a recipe that survived through generations, carrying family history in every soft bite. Lemon icebox pie was the cold, creamy reunion dessert that vanished quickly, especially during summer gatherings when people stayed outside under trees and tents, passing slices across folding tables. She whisked condensed milk, lemon juice, and egg yolks into a smooth filling that thickened naturally before being poured into a crumb crust pressed tightly with skilled fingers. The pie chilled in the refrigerator until firm, developing a bright tart flavor that felt refreshing in humid weather and revived anyone wilted by the heat. Topped with whipped cream, it sliced beautifully into cool, velvety wedges that disappeared almost as fast as she could serve them. Sometimes she added lemon zest for a stronger bite. Sometimes she froze the pie slightly for an extra chill, but it always hit the spot. Lemon icebox pie was beloved because it cooled. The body lifted the mood and tasted like bright sunshine captured in a dessert bowl handed out with love. Chocolate meringue pie was the kind of special occasion dessert that made the entire reunion crowd stop and stare when someone carried it across the yard. The chocolate filling was rich, smooth, and deeply comforting, cooked on the stove until it thickened into a glossy pudding-like consistency that tasted indulgent even before it reached the crust. She poured the warm filling into a baked shell, letting it settle before turning her attention to the meringue. Egg whites, sugar, and patience whipped together into tall, shining peaks that curled at the tips like soft white flames. She spread the meringue high across the top, making sure it touched the crust so it would not shrink, then baked it until the peaks turned golden brown. When the pie cooled, the meringue stood proudly above the chocolate layer, like a cloud sitting on a dark horizon. Every slice was a balance of silky chocolate crisp crust and airy sweetness. It was a pie meant for sharing, meant for showing off, and meant for making memories at the reunion dessert table. Pound cake trifles made from leftover cake were the clever reunion dessert trick grandmothers used to stretch what they had into something that looked brand new. When slices of pound cake began to dry out, she cut them into cubes, soaking them lightly with fruit juice pudding or sweetened cream to bring them back to life. Then she layered the cubes with fruit custard and whipped topping, building the dessert in glass bowls where each layer showed like colorful stripes. Peaches, strawberries, bananas, or canned fruit cocktail all worked beautifully, adding sweetness and color to the creamy layers. By the time the trifle was finished, no one could guess it had started with leftovers. It tasted soft, refreshing, and indulgent, especially after a heavy meal. Pound cake trifles proved that resourcefulness was part of the reunion tradition, turning yesterday's dessert into today's showstopper. Homemade fudge squares were the dense, chocolatey treats that always appeared in foil-lined dishes, tucked between cakes and pies on the reunion table. She cooked sugar, butter, cocoa, and milk on the stove, stirring constantly until the mixture bubbled thick and glossy. After removing it from the heat, she added vanilla and sometimes chopped nuts before beating it by hand to achieve the perfect texture. Then she poured the mixture into a pan lined with foil, smoothing the top before letting it cool and firm. Once set, she cut the fudge into neat squares, each one rich, creamy, and deeply satisfying. Children grabbed pieces with sticky fingers, and adults tucked extra squares into napkins for the ride home. Homemade fudge tasted like celebration and togetherness, dense with flavor and memory. Persimmon pudding was the regional dessert that appeared at reunions in areas where backyard persimmon trees grew heavy with fruit. She scooped the soft, ripe pulp and mixed it with sugar, eggs, flour, and warm spices, creating a batter that baked into a dense, comforting pudding. The texture was somewhere between cake and custard, moist, rich, and fragrant with cinnamon and nutmeg. Served warm with whipped cream or vanilla ice cream, it tasted like earthy sweetness layered with deep seasonal flavor. Families passed the pudding around in generous spoonfuls, celebrating the short window when persimmons were perfectly ripe. It was a dessert tied closely to place, memory, and heritage, making each bite a reminder of home. Banana bread with pecans was the easy, reliable loaf that traveled well wrapped in foil, ready to slice and share under reunion tents. She mashed overripe bananas into the batter, adding moisture, sweetness, and a warm aroma that filled the kitchen long before the bread finished baking. Chopped pecans folded into the mixture added crunch and richness, giving each slice a satisfying texture. The loaf, baked into a golden brown bread with a tender crumb that held together even in warm weather, banana bread was comforting, familiar, and humble enough to serve alongside grander desserts without ever feeling overlooked. It was the kind of dessert loved by children, elders, and everyone in between because it tasted like home and carried the kindness of using what you had. Pig's feet with vinegar sauce were not for the impatient or the faint-hearted. They demanded long hours of boiling and careful cleaning before the meat turned silky soft and rich with flavor. For many families, this dish represented endurance itself, transforming what others threw away into a delicacy that filled the soul. The vinegar cut through the heaviness, adding a tang that woke the taste buds and stretched the appetite. When cooked just right, the gelatin shimmered, thickening the sauce and coating every tender bite. Pig's feet weren't glamorous, but they were honest. They told the truth about survival, about making something from nearly nothing and taking pride in it. Around tables, they sparked stories and laughter, the kind only shared by people who'd known struggle and joy in equal measure. The smell of that vinegar sauce carried through neighborhoods like a promise that good eating didn't need riches. It reminded everyone that patience, thrift, and skill could turn even the roughest ingredients into a dish worthy of celebration. Pig's feet with vinegar sauce were a triumph of flavor and faith, proof that nothing worth keeping ever comes easy. Cane top syrup began with the earliest shoots of sugarcane, long before the full harvest. When planters reserved the mature stalks for commercial sugar, enslaved workers cut the tender tops and simmered them slowly, extracting a thin but sweet syrup. This homemade sweetener flavored cornbread, porridge, and hot drinks, adding a rare touch of luxury to daily meals. The technique reflected both African experience with cane and Caribbean methods of small batch syrup making. After emancipation, many rural families continued to boil cane juice into syrup during the early season, a practice still alive in parts of Louisiana and Florida. The flavor is lighter and grassier than late-season molasses, making it unique among Southern sweeteners. Cane top syrup shows how skilled hands transformed what might have been discarded into something valuable, blending cultural knowledge with the natural rhythms of the crop. It stands as a reminder that, even in conditions of deprivation, African-American cooks created enduring regional flavors that remain treasured in Southern pantries today. Sorghum syrup bread was a wartime and Depression-era answer to expensive refined sugar. Sorghum, a tall grass grown widely in the South, was boiled down into a thick, dark syrup that tasted earthy and sweet. Families would use it in place of sugar, mixing it into simple bread doughs to stretch rations and still enjoy something satisfying. Sorghum syrup bread was hearty, with a flavor that carried a touch of bitterness but warmed the spirit. Children often slathered slices with butter or drippings, while adults enjoyed it with strong coffee. It was a farm food at its core, tied directly to the fields where sorghum stalks grew. Sorghum bread meant that no one had to give up sweetness completely even when sugar prices were too high or stores ran out. This loaf was practical, easy to make at home, and deeply tied to Southern soil. After times of scarcity passed, sorghum faded, but the memory of that dark bread stayed. Rabbit and dumplings was the meal that turned a quiet woodland hunt into a hearty family supper when store-bought meat was rare. Hunters brought back rabbits dressed and cleaned, and cooks simmered the lean meat slowly with onions, carrots, and herbs until it fell from the bone. Soft, floured dumplings were dropped into the rich broth, swelling as they absorbed the savory flavor and thickened the stew. The dish fed large households through cold nights, stretching a single rabbit to satisfy many plates. Children learned to roll the dumpling dough while elders told stories of patient mornings in the woods and the respect owed to the animal that provided the meal. The aroma of simmering broth filled cabins and farm kitchens, promising comfort after long days of work. With modern markets providing endless options, few families still prepare rabbit in this old style. Yet those who recall the tender meat and pillowy dumplings speak of a warmth and gratitude that no packaged dinner can ever replace. Fried rice with scrambled egg was the kind of supper that could be made out of almost nothing but still managed to feel hearty. Leftover rice was saved from the night before, reheated in a skillet with a little oil or lard, and then combined with scrambled egg to add richness. My grandmother would sometimes add chopped onion or green pepper if the garden allowed, but the dish stood strong even without extras. The rice fried up golden, the egg binding it together into something more than scraps. A dash of salt and pepper finished it, though hot sauce often appeared at the table too. What amazed me was how it transformed simple grains into a filling plate that stretched across a family without breaking the budget. The meal carried warmth and thrift in equal measure, reminding everyone that dinner did not need meat to be satisfying. In the 1960s, fried rice with scrambled egg was not fancy, but it was dependable, the kind of dish that fed children and adults alike with just enough to keep spirits steady. Hot water. Cornbread was the sound of sizzling batter and the smell of home. With just cornmeal, salt, and boiling water, cooks created a golden miracle that fed whole families for pennies. It was crisp on the outside, tender on the inside, and tasted like the countryside itself. The beauty of it was in its simplicity. No milk, no eggs, no fuss, just skill and heat. Each cake was fried in cast iron, often in saved bacon grease that gave it a smoky edge. Children would snatch them off the pan before they cooled, blowing on them between bites. It paired with everything, greens, beans, or stew, but it never needed company to shine. Hot water cornbread taught generations that good food came from the hands, not the wallet. It was born out of necessity but carried the pride of invention. The sound of cornmeal hitting the skillet was like a heartbeat, steady and sure, in homes that had seen hard times. A simple mix of grain and grit, it embodied the spirit of those who refused to go hungry or hopeless. Hot water. Cornbread was survival turned into comfort, one crispy bite at a time. Ever wonder what survival foods served to slaves on plantations were really like? These gritty meals kept people going with scraps and wild finds under brutal heat. What stories hide in those flavors waiting to be uncovered? Collard green Potlikker soup captured the very essence of slow cooking and careful stewardship. After hours of simmering collard greens with smoked meat, the broth left in the pot was a mineral-rich elixir, treasured as much as the greens themselves. Families poured this flavorful liquid into bowls and sipped it with pieces of cornbread, believing it to restore strength and spirit after long days of work. Some added hot pepper vinegar for a lively kick, while others preferred it plain and soothing. Children learned early never to throw away the Potlikker, understanding that its nutrients were too valuable to waste. Neighbors often shared jars with the sick or elderly, turning the simple broth into a gesture of care and healing. Modern kitchens may overlook this tradition, discarding the liquid without thought, but for those who remember, the taste of Potlikker carries the memory of community generosity and the wisdom of using every drop the garden and the kitchen could provide. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Crumb-fried saltfish was proof that even the toughest cuts could be transformed with a little creativity. Saltfish was cheap and lasted forever, but it was hard and strong-flavored, needing love and time to make it shine. Families would soak it overnight, then roll it in crushed biscuit crumbs before frying it in a skillet until golden. The smell of it could draw neighbors from down the street, salty and rich with that perfect crisp edge. Paired with grits or boiled greens, it made breakfast feel like a celebration. The crumbs gave it crunch, the oil gave it warmth, and the memories gave it meaning. In every Southern kitchen, There was a version of this dish waiting to happen, handed down and reimagined through generations. Crumb-fried saltfish was not fancy food, it was pride disguised as thrift, a simple recipe that carried the power to feed both stomach and spirit. Smoked catfish tails reveal the skill and resourcefulness that defined survival cooking on plantations near rivers and coastal waters. After commercial fishermen or estate kitchens took the prime fillets, the bony tails and smaller pieces were often left behind. Enslaved cooks cleaned these scraps carefully, rubbed them with salt or local spices, and smoked them over slow hickory fires. The result was a flavorful preserved fish that kept for days and could be stirred into stews, crumbled over grains, or eaten on its own with cornbread. Smoking techniques reflected West African traditions carried across the Atlantic, where preserving fish with wood smoke had long been a way to ensure protein during lean seasons. In later years, African American fish camps and southern smokehouses continued this method, turning a food of necessity into a celebrated regional specialty. Modern smoked catfish dishes found in Mississippi and Louisiana restaurants still trace their flavor back to these early practices of careful preservation and culinary creativity born from scarcity. Field pea salad with hot pepper vinegar offered a cool bite for the hottest southern evenings. Tender field peas were boiled until just soft, then chilled and tossed with diced onions, sweet peppers, and a splash of sharp vinegar infused with fiery peppers. The salad balanced earthy legumes with a bright tang that woke the palate after long days in the sun. Served on wide porches as cicadas sang, it accompanied fried chicken, grilled fish, or simply a hunk of cornbread. Home gardeners prized field peas for their reliability in poor soil, and the vinegar peppers were often homemade, steeped for weeks in glass bottles on sunny windowsills. Guests at summer suppers remembered the sting of the vinegar and the gentle sweetness of the peas as the taste of true Southern hospitality. Today, packaged beans and bottled dressings have replaced the careful soaking and seasoning that once defined the dish, but the memory of its crisp, refreshing bite lingers in kitchens where tradition still holds strong. Stewed chicken backs were one of those meals that turned scraps into sustenance. In the 1960s, the back of the chicken was considered the cheapest cut, with little meat clinging to the bones. My grandmother bought them in bulk, cleaned them, and simmered them for hours with onions, potatoes, and carrots until the broth grew rich and fragrant. The long cooking softened the bits of meat so they slid easily from the bones, creating a meal that was both filling and flavorful. Families served the stew over rice or with cornbread, stretching the broth even further. The dish carried smoky undertones if she added a ham bone or a splash of fatback, but it was nourishing even without extras. What made it memorable was how something so overlooked could still feel satisfying and dignified at the table. Stewed chicken backs reminded families that nothing should be wasted, and even the smallest scraps could anchor a full dinner. It was a meal of patience, thrift, and creativity, proof that the cheapest part of the bird could still feed a household with warmth and pride. Ash cake bread was born out of fire and hunger, a recipe that came alive in the heart of hard times. Cornmeal, salt, and water were all it needed. The dough was pressed together by hand and buried right into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace. It baked slowly, the outside hardening into a smoky crust, while the inside stayed soft, golden, and warm. When it came out, people brushed away the ashes, broke it open, and drizzled it with syrup or molasses. It had a taste that was both sweet and earthy, like the memory of home on a Sunday morning. Ash cake bread was a working person's meal, something you could make after a long day without needing an oven or a fancy pan. It was food that did not waste or wait, made for those who had nothing extra but still found comfort in what little they had. The smell of it filled small cabins and quiet kitchens, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with laughter or prayer. Every crumb reminded people that strength could grow even from ashes. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge transformed leftover seeds into a hearty meal that supplied both protein and healthy oils. After pumpkins were cooked for pies or stews, the seeds were washed, dried, and pounded into a coarse meal. This meal was simmered slowly in water or thin milk, creating a creamy porridge with a subtle nutty flavor. Sweetened lightly with honey or molasses when available, it became a sustaining breakfast or evening dish that used every part of the harvest. The method reflected West African culinary traditions where ground seeds thickened soups and stews, showing how transplanted knowledge enriched American foodways. Generations after emancipation, pumpkin seed porridge remained a seasonal specialty in some rural areas, appreciated for its nourishing qualities and gentle taste. Modern cooks might recognize it in contemporary seed-based milks and cereals, proving that this centuries-old practice still influences how we eat today. Ground pumpkin seed porridge highlights the wisdom of never wasting what nature provides and celebrates a heritage of careful resourcefulness that continues to inspire. If one of these reunion desserts brought back a taste you had forgotten, share your memory in the comments and tap like and subscribe so these sweet traditions can keep finding their way back home.